Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ISS. Happy New Year. The meeting today is on power of currencies and currencies of power, with a discussion meeting on our launch of the book. The dollar status is the leading global currency, gives the US immense political as well as financial effect, but that power risks being eroded with unpredictable strategic consequences as the Chinese renminbi and possibly other currencies assume greater prominence. The book that we published assesses how long the US will be able to maintain its exorbitant privilege in tandem with rising China. It examines the obstacles China must first overcome in its quest to internationalise its currency and the strategic consequences if it succeeds. We have changed to the usual book launch format. Two people on the podium today, going with me on one. Dr Sanjaya Baru is the director of the geoeconomics program there. He will speak first to talk a little about the program, the event that we held in Bahrain some 18 months ago, which was the genesis of this book, and then we will turn to Alan Wheatley, recently departed from Reuters, latterly their chief economics correspondent. Who will speak about the book as he was the principal author and editor. Sanjay.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. This afternoon is really Alan's afternoon, since we are here to launch a book that he has edited. But as the host of the conference that produced this book, I have the opportunity and the privilege to say a few words and keep it brief and pass on the baton to Alan. My own interest, I must add, in this subject was provoked by an invitation before I joined IISS from the Carnegie Endowment in Washington to speculate in 2009 on what they call the geopolitical consequences of the global financial crisis. And I wrote a paper for the Carnegie Endowment, basically arguing that the gradual shift that we were beginning to see from the turn of the century with the rise of China and the slowing down of the transatlantic economies, particularly Europe, would be accentuated by that shock. So you have a gradual long-term shift happening, but that this shift would be accentuated by the shock that was injected by the crisis. And then some of you would have read James Rickards' book called Currency Wars, in which he informed us that actually the Department of Defense in Washington, D.C. Did a war game on the strategic or the national security consequences of a financial crisis. And Rickards describes the Lehman collapse and the financial crisis following that, to use his phrase, the financial Pearl Harbor, that then woke up the United States into dealing with a range of challenges, financial, fiscal challenges. And what we have seen happening over the last 4 or 5 years since the transatlantic financial crisis, both in the domestic economies of the transatlantic economies, particularly Europe with its debt and budgetary crisis, but also in the United States with fiscal restructuring and the budget issues, is that the financial crisis has played out in terms of the ability of governments to address larger national security challenges. It's not a secret that some of the financial factors have influenced US strategy in the Middle East as well as in South Asia. So looking at all these events and trends, and of course when the QE1 and the QE2 was unleashed, the Brazilian finance minister went public talking about a currency war, and then Arvind Subramanian at the Peterson Institute wrote a book called Eclipse, in which he actually forecast the end of the dollar era and the beginning of the renminbi era. So we believe that the time had come for us at the IISS in the geoeconomics program to take a serious look at some of these trends, whether in fact exaggerated analysis of people like Arvind Subramanian was was relevant. Was the dollar in the kind of crisis that he was suggesting? Was the path for the renminbi as smooth as being suggested at that time? Or was this a crisis that could be managed, and then we all return to this world of a dollar-denominated global economy? I think this book comes out of that question that we posed ourselves, and we brought together an interesting group of bankers, fiscal policy analysts, IMF economists, strategic thinkers, geopolitical analysts, a distinguished journalist like Wheatley, to Bahrain to discuss these issues. We had a paper from the former defense minister of Japan, Yuriko Koiko, which is reproduced in this book. So we had a Chinese perspective, we had a Japanese perspective, we had an American perspective, we had other European perspectives. And I think this book brings together all these perspectives. The summary that we are left with at the end of our conference is, given that money has three roles as a unit of measure, a store of value, or medium of transaction, the sharp increase in China's share of world trade, and we had a WTO Deputy Director General at the conference who did the paper, and that paper is reproduced as well in this book. Given the rise in China's share of world trade, it was quite clear that the renminbi was going to be an increasingly important medium of exchange. It would also be an important unit of account, given growing transactions involving both trade and FDI emanating from China. But I think the critical question was, would it also evolve into a store of value, which is the most important role of money in any case. And I think there the conference focused on the intangible about money, which is trust. That at the end of the day, it is the transparency and the openness of the US system that continues to invest trust in the dollar. And it's not simply power, but trust that also plays a role. In other words, unlike in the sphere of military affairs, it's not really a physical capability, but international trust in your ability to manage that gives the dollar. And that this poses a policy challenge to China. It's not that China cannot overcome that challenge, but it's a challenge it has to overcome. In other words, create a more transparent policy environment that will make other countries and all players in the market trust the exchange rate policies, etc. And I think those are the kind of, that was a key message that the conference ended with. I should only add one more word before I before I hand over to the chair, which is that the one issue, considering our conference was in Bahrain, I think the one issue which we did not address was the role of the dollar in the oil market. And clearly that has been an important factor contributing to the dollar's global acceptability or global role. And given that the US is becoming increasingly self-reliant in oil or energy, with shale gas, and that in fact Asian economies like China and India are becoming bigger importers of Middle East oil, what role would the structural shifts in the oil economy play in shaping the role of the dollar as opposed to other currencies? And a final word, I think mirroring what is actually happening in the sphere of geopolitics, which is the world moving from its unipolar moment and from a bipolar earlier era to an increasingly multipolar, I mean, one in which the United States remains the dominant power, but where the US is increasingly unable to intervene unilaterally and is required to hold hands with other powers. That reality of the geopolitical world is reflected in the money markets. That the dollar remains the dominant currency, that the United States remains the dominant power. But there are other currencies which are increasingly beginning to play a role. So it's more likely that, unlike what Arvind Subramanian predicted in his book, where he in fact assumed that the shift that's going to happen is very similar to what happened in the 20th century, where the British pound yielded space to the US dollar. That unlike that kind of a movement from one currency to another, what we are likely to see is a movement to a more multipolar structure, in which Chinese renminbi, of course, will be an important currency. But one should not underestimate the role of other, particularly the 5 Rs, the ruble, the real, the rupee, the rupaya, and the 4 Rs. And the 4 Rs have an increasing share of both the energy market and commodity markets. So those are kind of open-ended issues which I don't want to speculate more on. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Sanjaya. As Sanjaya said, our starting point is that the dollar remains very much the dominant currency. What we try to do in the book, and when I say we, I'm just one of the authors, so I'm speaking on behalf of the others in a way, is to try and isolate, try and identify specific examples of how the United States has deployed the dollar as an instrument of power. I'm old enough to have attended the Plaza Accord in 1985, where the United States essentially threatened to keep talking down the dollar unless Germany and Japan reflated their economies. That was a repetition of what had happened in the 1970s. More recently, things have evolved. There's a chapter in the book devoted to how the United States has been able to apply pressure to Iran by dint of the fact that the dollar, as the linchpin of the global financial system, permits the United States to essentially blacklist any entity that deals with Iran. I think that was a concrete example of the power of currencies. Now, of course, economic, financial, diplomatic, military power, they're all interrelated. They're mutually reinforcing, they're overlapping. And we provide an example in the book of how sometimes these things come together. In the case of Afghanistan, when the United States led the UN-authorized invasion, the first thing that happened was that secret agents landed and essentially coerced, bribed Afghan warlords to act for the US, and they did so by paying them off with dollars that had been freshly printed by the Federal Reserve. That's another example of the power of currencies. That is the past, and the thrust of the book is really to explore how events might unfold, how the landscape might change in the years to come. And despite the success I just mentioned with respect to Iran, then there's a very good argument to be made that US influence in the field of international economics and monetary policy is fading. The United States has failed to prevent China from building up a huge war chest of foreign exchange reserves. In other words, it's failed in persuading China to liberalize its exchange rate, arguably at the cost of millions of lost US manufacturing jobs. Tim Geithner, the former Treasury Secretary, failed in his attempt to get the rest of the G20 to agree to criteria that would have required surplus countries such as China and Germany to share the burden of the adjustment of global imbalances. So as economic power is shifting from the developed to the emerging economies, the book, as Sanjaya says, shares the consensus that we are moving to a more diverse international monetary system, possibly with a kaleidoscope of currencies, as Harsha Singh spells out in his book. And we're already seeing that on the ground with a greater role for currencies such as the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar. But by and large, we do not share some of the excitable speculation that is present in the press that the RMB is set to dethrone the dollar in the foreseeable future. Let me explain why. Well, first of all, there's the power of incumbency when it comes to reserve currency status. It took, the United States overtook Great Britain as the largest economy in the world in around about 1870. It was another 40 years, and the damage done through the First World War before the dollar dethroned sterling, and then only temporarily as the principal reserve currency. And if you think of all the travails that the United States has gone through recently, and Sanjaya touched on a few of them, it's astonishing that the dollar reserve, the dollar's dominant role is pretty much unchallenged. The dollar has lost 20% or more of its value against a basket of currencies since the end of Bretton Woods. The US government has close to default twice in the last couple of years. We have a government shutdown, the political system is dysfunctional, the United States has embarked on 2 wars that many people think were misguided, and yet the dollar dominates in trade, in finance, and investment. It's a currency for denomination of most commodities, and for the, importantly this, for the underlying derivative contracts. More than 60% of global reserves, at least those whose composition is disclosed to the IMF, are still in dollars. If the dollar is losing its predominant status, then it is not yet evident in the figures, at least that's my interpretation. The second reason is the geopolitical ties that bind the United States to countries that are major holders of the dollar. I think of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Saudi Arabia and others. I think of Japan, I think of South Korea, Taiwan. Just a thought experiment. Can we imagine the circumstances under which, say, Japan would abandon the dollar? The dollar dominates Japan's foreign exchange reserves. There's a tacit, if not somewhere, a secret, explicit quid pro quo that Japan will hold dollars in return for coming under the protection of the United States military umbrella. Now, if that sounds a bit far-fetched, we have evidence going back to the 1960s when Germany, as the Bretton Woods system was drawing to a close, was considering whether it should follow the lead of France and sell its gold holdings and cash them in for dollars. And there was an explicit move by the United States requiring the Bundesbank to commit not to sell its gold. Otherwise, the United States said, look, we'll be forced for financial reasons to withdraw one or more of our divisions from Europe. And that would have opened the door to greater Soviet influence and the possible development in Germany of nuclear weapons. I think that is another concrete example of the underlying theme of the book, which is the power of currencies and the currencies of power. The third reason why we see the dollar remaining dominant is doubts about the main pretenders, the Eurozone, or the Euro, and the renminbi. I'm probably in a minority of one in being optimistic about the Euro. Move swiftly. Stuart Fleming too, thank you Stuart. Moving swiftly on, I'm happy to talk about that later. But clearly the up-and-coming contender, pretender is China. The great financial crisis, I was in China for 6 years for Reuters, and the great financial crash of 2007 and 2008, this is my reading, was the last straw for China. The dollar's dominance, the dollar's primacy was allowing the United States to live beyond its means, and the book goes into some detail as to the ins and outs of seniorage, and yet was at the center of a system that was creating crisis after crisis. And the stock market crash of 2000, the Asian financial crisis, the savings and loan crisis in the United States at the end of the 80s before that, etc. And what's more, China felt that the system was concentrating power unfairly in the hands of the old order, not just the United States, but the G7. Now, of course, you could argue, in parentheses, that China only had itself to blame for perpetuating the system because it was buying the dollars to hold down its own currency. And again, we can come back to that. But I think there was a recognition politically in China that they needed to do something. And in order to have skin in the game, that meant that they had to start liberalising the renminbi, which until then, and even still now largely, is in a walled garden, shut off from the rest of the world. The consensus of the book is that a growing international role for the renminbi is inevitable. It certainly would be natural. As economies grow, they obtain the power to price their exports in their own currency. That's what happened to Japan, to Germany, to the United States. It would be astonishing if this were not happening to China. But as John Williamson says in the book, which I think reflects the centre of gravity in the debate, and for the next 25 years at least, the dollar is going to remain dominant. John, who is one of the outstanding currency economists of his generation, is hesitant about predicting, however, whether the dollar will remain dominant 50 years' time. Now, I'm on the sceptical side. I was very encouraged by the results of the third plenum back in November with the moves towards liberalisation, but as I argue in the book, I strongly doubt whether financial liberalisation, which is essential for China to develop the RMB as a reserve currency, is compatible with the Communist Party's continued monopoly of political power. I hope I'm wrong, because I think it's in everybody's interest, including China's and including the Communist parties, to have a more open system. But I think the vested interests that stand in the way of liberalised interest rates, liberalised exchange rate, and open capital account, all of those things which are essential for the RMB to become a reserve currency, I think those vested interests will prevail for the foreseeable future. So I, just as a rule of thumb, I'll be watching very closely what happens to China's reserve stockpile. $3.66 trillion and counting as we speak. As Sanjaya said, even though if those technical conditions are met, let's suppose we wave a magic wand and we have a fully convertible RMB tomorrow, I think it will take a long time for China to build up the trust and the credibility that underpins any currency, in any fiat currency, which is not backed by gold or by silver. As a historical footnote, it's worth remembering that back in 1812, Alexander Hamilton was insisting that the United States continue to pay interest to its British bondholders, even though Britain had set fire to the White House. And that paid off a century later when people were able to look at the institutions that the United States had laid down over the preceding decades. It's going to take China time, even once it's established a rule of law, accountability, transparency, checks and balances, for people to place sufficient trust in the RMB as a core of value, as Sanjaya stressed. I don't see that happening overnight. I think it's a process that's going to last decades. Let me move on. Sanjaya mentioned soft power, which I think is nebulous, intangible for any economists in the room. They won't like the concept, but I've read enough and I've learned enough over the course of the years to truly believe that soft power reinforces the hard power underpinning a currency. And I think China has a long way to go in this respect. There's a lot about this in the book. So where does that leave us? The markets, financial markets are calm right now, but just how solid, I keep asking myself, are the foundations, the monetary foundations of the global economy. Central banks have had to resort to wave after wave of quantitative easing with so far patchy results. We are dealing, as Bob Zelig says in the concluding chapter of the book, still with the unfinished business of Bretton Woods. I personally think there needs to be a sort of mechanism that John Maynard Keynes advocated and that Tim Geithner was in effect advocating, so that there is more of a burden on surplus countries such as China and Germany to share the burden of the adjustment, the correction of global imbalances. But as Zelig said, we shouldn't expect any grand treaty of global convocation to lead to a competitive multi-currency system. He speaks instead of an accumulating incrementalism. So for geostrategic purposes, what does that mean? I think it would be good for the world if there was if monetary power were more evenly shared. A three-legged stool is more stable than a shooting stick. But will we get there without any strains, any political and any economic strains? Will the United States accommodate China's inevitable military and monetary rise? It has to be an open question. The passage of power from an established power to an up-and-coming power is never easy. I'm going to finish by reading a quote from the book from one of the political scientists who has written extensively on it. Jonathan Kershaw said, as long as there are states and money, states will attempt to manipulate monetary relations to advance their political objectives. That's been the lesson of the past century, and I guess it's going to be the lesson of the next century. Thank you.
Alan, thank you very much. As you can tell, it was a wide-ranging discussion, both in Bahrain and also in this book, so it's a very wide field for questions, which I propose to take now. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Two here. I propose to take them in a pair, so both, well, actually we'll take them in three. So first, please, David.
Thank you very much. David Buchan, Oxford Energy Institute. I'm rather surprised that when you were talking about Bahrain, you didn't talk about currencies in the oil market. It's a rather odd place not to talk about it, but I would also suggest it's not terribly important. Because currency is simply used as a benchmark, a sort of denominator for barrels of oil or other commodities. And I mean, it is dollars now, but it could be, I guess it might have been sterling at one point, it could be Swiss francs, or it could be apples or something. So I just wonder, I would suggest that even though that and I wonder whether you agree, Alan, even though US power will decline and US actually oil exports may decline dramatically, Chinese monetary political power will rise, so will their oil exports. It perhaps doesn't make much, there's no real reason for oil not to continue to be priced in dollars, because it's simply a convenience. And it would take a very sharp American decline and a huge Chinese increase in power and whatever to create a tipping point that people decide, oh, well, this is, we need to move to another benchmark of convenience. Your views, thank you.
Lady on your left.
Camila Borik University, and my question is about the method that you apply in your book. So it seems to me that you hinted at historical comparison, such as how it happened when the US was overtaking the UK, and also it seems that a big role was played by some kind of rule of inevitability, that China seems to be rising, so its currency will rise as well. But on the other hand, the empirical record is only limited, so the dollar is still very strong, as it is reflected by the by the records up to date. So in this case, how do you define this inevitability? Thank you.
Jonathan Paris.
Jonathan Paris, a London-based consultant, currently focused on China, Africa, and the Middle East. Quick question on your presentation. You said Japan made an implicit deal to hold dollars, but Germany in the 60s wanted to sell gold for dollars, but was dissuaded by the U.S. to hold gold. I'm confused why in one case holding dollars helped the U.S., but in the German case it would hurt the U.S. But my substantive question is something we talked about at the cocktail hour, and that is, couldn't China, instead of confronting the dollar, go incrementally by inducing countries where they have enormous trade relationships, such as in Southern Africa, or maybe Latin America in the future, and persuade them to trade in their currency, and thereby gain incremental power from the outside in?
Thank you for those. I'll take David's first. I completely agree with you. There's no reason why. There's no reason oil is denominated in dollars as a convenience. In fact, it supports my point that the infrastructure underpinning the oil market, I'm thinking of the derivative contracts, for example, are priced in dollars, and so it would take a huge shock for people to suddenly decide to switch from one currency to another. We are inevitably, I shouldn't use that word, in the realm of speculation. But let's suppose, for example, that as the RMB liberalises and becomes more attractive as a store of value, then more of the oil trade between the Middle East and China is perhaps still denominated in dollars, if you like, because as you say, it's just a convenience stake, it's the global benchmark, but is settled in RMB and is therefore accumulates in the bank accounts of the oil exporters. I think the underlying economics of that would point to a big shift in power. And that speaks to Jonathan's point as well. I think it would be logical if China were to propose to its trading partners, especially in Africa and Latin America, that they conduct more of their trade in RMB. It might still be denominated in dollars. Copper, grain are globally traded commodities denominated in dollars, as David said, for the sake of everyone, for the convenience of everybody, let's call them dollars, but we will be settling them in RMB. That would give big clout, I think, and power to the Chinese, because the next time one of its trading partners got into financial trouble, to whom would they turn? Would they turn to the IMF with all the conditions that the IMF brackets Washington would impose, or would they turn to China and say, okay, let's extend our relationship even further? And I've heard from friends in the markets that this is already happening, that cargoes of commodities not involving China, in fact, are being traded from Africa to Asia in RMB. To take the lady's question, nothing is inevitable, and I apologise if I gave, in my eagerness to give firm opinions, I strayed too far. Certainly history, let's hope that history is no guide, because the dollar displaced sterling largely as a result of 2 world wars that drained Britain of treasure and men. If I say there's an inevitability, I followed up immediately by saying it is natural, over the economic history shows this, that as countries get bigger and their exporters get more pricing power, then they will say to their trading partners, okay, well, let's trade in my currency rather than in your currency or in a third currency, which today overwhelmingly is the dollar. So that's what I meant as economies grow their currencies, by and large, assume a greater role in international trade and finance.
Yeah, I entirely agree with Alan's response to those questions, both about oil and the question about the Chinese trade and potential for rising growth. I just want to add one additional point here, which is if you read Bob Zelik's essay in the book, and I think Bob Zelik makes this point, that while it is true that the lack of adequate transparency, policy transparency in the case of Beijing, and the fact that Washington DC has a longer track record of building trust internationally, tend to help the dollar versus the renminbi. I think we should not be complacent, or certainly the US policymakers should not be complacent about the management of the dollar. And one of the concerns globally in the last 3-4 years has been about the quality of monetary and economic management in the United States, both at a political level and at a professional level. The fact is that today there is much more attention given to who would be head of the Federal Reserve than would be the Defense Secretary of the United States. I mean, Janet Yellen has got more space out of Financial Times in the last 6 months than either the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, because those appointments are fundamental to retaining international trust in the system. But it comes after a period in which internationally trust in the US political leadership, given the debates on the fiscal management, is beginning to shake a bit. And I think, therefore, I think there's a point that Bob Zelik flags, and it's just as well that someone as distinguished as Bob Zelik has flagged this in the book, and those of you who write about the book or review probably draw attention to it. I think the US has to understand that it cannot forever retain international trust. And certainly Chinese leadership know that this is one of China's weakness. And it's not as if they're going to ignore that weakness. China is trying to build trust. There is greater trust today in many parts of the world. Somebody mentioned Southern Africa. But more importantly, the major trading economies of Asia are willing to transact in the renminbi. Renminbi transactions are increasing. So the Chinese are aware that they need to build trust internationally in their currency. And I think the US should never take its eyes off that objective, because at the end of the day, it's not power, it's not military power, but it's trust that determines how much different economies are willing to hold their reserves in one currency or another.
Thank you. I have 3 more questions on this side of the aisle, and then we'll swap to the other side. Firstly, the lady at the back, please.
Thank you. It's Lily from Chinese Embassy. Just now you stressed a lot about liberalization of capital control and the trust issue for the rise of RMB. But I'm thinking of Japanese yen. Japan is a very large economy, and it exports worldwide, and it has free exchange rate floating and liberalized capital control. And politically, it has Western allies. It's part of G7, so it may not have the trust issue that we have. So why Japanese yen so far has not changed the domination of dollar and occupied only a negligible share of the reserve? Thank you.
I'll get to you in a minute, please. I'm sorry, it's Ben Barry first. I just want to say I've got your question.
Ben Barry from the Institute. I hope you don't consider this a mischievous question, although I'll be happily told it's a red herring. The question is, if you were writing the book today, what would you say about Bitcoin? The reason I ask this is because many of the strategic trends on all dimensions since Bretton Woods have made the boundary of the state and the ability for it to pull its classic levers different. And is Bitcoin a harbinger of the future, you know, a currency that could exist without a state? Or is it merely a niche that's powering dark exchanges on the dark side of the web? Or is it just a sophisticated form of barter, rather like gold bars and sovereigns, can still perform that function?
And then, gentleman, one row in front of you in glasses.
Sorry, Chris Jackson, I'm associate with the Institute as well. My question, I guess, is you talked a lot about whether so China could become the reserve currency, the renminbi could become a reserve currency. I guess my question is, do the Chinese people want it to become a reserve currency? And I guess my question would be, how will the Chinese policymakers in the future adapt to conflicting demands of their people, where a rising middle class who already been writing a lot about how they feel they've been deprived of purchasing power will be able to balance against people actually who are saying that their jobs and their economies and their livelihood is more important, and therefore how will that sort of play out? I guess would be my question to you.
With that, we're here till midnight to answer that last one. If I can, let me start with the lady from the Chinese embassy. Japan's share of global reserves peaked in 1991 at 9% of the total. Until then, Japan had largely resisted the liberalization of its financial markets that would have been necessary, a necessary but not sufficient condition, a necessary condition to make the yen attractive as a reserve currency. And it was only in the 1990s when the authorities realized the potential benefits that would accrue from having the yen play a larger international role. They started seriously to try to implement the measures that would have been necessary. But by then it was too late, because the Japanese economy was already starting a 20-year decline. So Japan missed its opportunity, in a word. On Bitcoin, the wise man speaks only of what he knows, and I don't know enough about Bitcoin. I don't know anything about Bitcoin beyond what I read in the Financial Times and The Economist, but I'm deeply, just as I'm skeptical about gold, I don't know if I can call Bitcoin a barbarous relic yet, but beyond being a medium of exchange, perhaps for the darker sides of the internet, as you mentioned, I just fail to see how it can function at all as a store of value. And I would have thought that by this time next week or next year, there is every possibility that there will be any number of competing digital currencies out there that will have driven the dollar value of a Bitcoin to zero. I could be completely wrong, it could be worth $1 million, but in a way that proves my point. If the underlying value of it is so unpredictable, how can it function as a store of value? And if that's the case, then it diminishes the utility of Bitcoin as a currency. Chris, is it right? Do the Chinese want the RMB to be a reserve currency? I think it's a little bit like St. Augustine, right? Lord, let me be chaste, but not just yet. They would like the power and the influence that comes with reserve currency status, yes. But are they willing to take the 1,001 steps needed? And read the book, and I argue that no, they are not, but they are on the horns of a dilemma. Because if they do not liberalise the economy and allow more scope for market forces, then they risk being overwhelmed by the imbalances that they've allowed to build up within China. And that's why I think this year and next will be critical to see whether the promises of reform announced at the third plenum are in fact implemented. I think we should look to see whether there are any inroads into the privileges, particularly of state-owned companies. I do not expect the Shanghai Free Trade Zone to lead to very much. China's history is of crossing the river by feeding the stones. And I would have thought that the liberalisation of the financial sector, which is absolutely critical, is going to remain very gradual. The minute that the Communist Party takes its hands off that particular lever of the economy and allows the market, not party members, party functionaries, to dictate where capital is flowing, then at that moment they've lost the power to control the economy, they've lost the power to distribute patronage, and they're undermining their own political position. I hope I'm wrong. I'm a big fan of China. I'm optimistic about China's future as an economy, but over the next few years there's going to be a crunch, and they're going to have to decide how much they can liberalise economically without jeopardising their political monopoly.
Thank you. 3 questions. Okay, Nicholas Redman.
Thank you. I thought that Alan's point about Alexander Hamilton in 1812 was very significant because it set out a short-term potential use of an economic weapon during a political argument and a long-term benefit from withholding. And I think with power comes not only great responsibility, but the need to exercise restraint. And I'm also a great fan of China, but I'm unclear as to whether China could resist the temptation to use economic weapons. And one looks at China's argument with the Philippines, where they brought an economic weapon into a political dispute. One looks at withholding exports of rare earths, a whole variety of short-term examples. And yet one also looks at the enormous restraint China has shown in holding large amounts of US treasuries, and not apparently using that in any way as a political weapon. So I wondered if Alan and Sanjay could say how they see this short-term versus long-term. It seems to be one of the crucial issues.
Hi, Stuart Flemings from Dr College, Oxford. In its Article 4 report in July, the International Monetary Fund warned of the threat of a systemic financial crisis in China as a result of the growth of its shadow banking system and local government finance. That situation only got worse, and there are now serious worries in financial markets that, far from following a track towards internationalisation and global confidence is about to erode in China. The People's Bank of China is using the internationalisation of the RMB to try and overcome the domestic vested interests and put pressure on the domestic financial system for reform. Very high-risk strategy. I mean, aren't we in danger here? I mean, high risk because we saw what happened in the Asian debt crisis, Latin America, etc., etc. The IMF also said the Chinese growth model is broken. That's in the Article 4. That's a document which was signed off by the Chinese authorities. Aren't we looking backwards here? There's a bigger threat that difficulties in the Chinese economy and the Chinese financial system would be the next leg of the global financial crisis.
And finally, gentlemen, right there.
Thank you. Vinod Kumar, member of the Institute. My question relates to, as the US power, the dollar power wanes over time, what impact will this have on the way they have sought to control the international economies, especially in the developing countries, through institutions such as IMF and World Bank? How would that pan out? I would be interested in the comments of the two speakers. Thank you.
Right. One of the many interesting aspects of the book is John Williamson's argument. I'm referring to Nicholas's question here about China's restraint. John Williamson argues that one of only 2 concrete examples of the power that the dollar bestows is that, he doesn't use such demotic language, is that America has China over a barrel. China cannot sell its reserves without taking such a huge loss that it would be disastrous politically and economically. So, Nicholas, you're spot on. And personally, I think China, I can understand why China originally accumulated reserves in order to encourage its export in industries. But even the PBOC Vice Governor recently, Egan, has been saying that we've reached a stage now where the marginal benefits of accruing further reserves are outweighed by the disadvantages, and I can completely agree with that. As far as the rare earths example goes, we could add other examples of Chinese behavior that its neighbors might consider provocative. I'm not saying they were, but they might be considered provocative, and it's the perceptions which are important in the context of nurturing the soft power that is an essential ingredient of supporting the hard power of currencies. So I do think China does need to strike a better balance there between standing up for its rights but being sensitive to the concerns of its neighbours. Let me turn now to Stuart's question. I completely agree with you again. I've been confident on China. I went there in 2005, and I was making, then I gave myself a mental framework that China's going to be fine for the next 10 years. Well, that 10 years are coming due. I still think that a country where the national savings rate is 50% of GDP, where they could mobilise 3.66 trillion in reserves, where they own the banks, and where the capital controls, according to the BIS, are still largely binding, and where central government debt, admittedly without contingent liabilities, is still very moderate by anybody's standards. China has the capacity in the coming years to gradually either roll over the debts or put them explicitly onto the books of the central government. The question, so that is looking backwards, as you say, how do we deal with the debts that have been accumulated to prevent them from sparking a crisis? And I'm confident that China will find a solution, but I cannot be sure. I think the more important question, Stuart, is the policies that China introduces now to change that broken growth model, to make sure that we don't get a new flow of bad debts from continued implementation of poor policies, so that we get further malinvestments in steel and all the other industries with overcapacity. On Mr. Kumar's question, I touched on it briefly in my remarks. There's a feeling, not just in China, but certainly in India and other emerging markets, that the United Nations, the makeup of the decision-making bodies of the United Nations, and I include the IMF in that, is past its sell-by date. The G7 has a role to play, yes, because they're all market economies with important currencies that have to be mobilized in a crisis, but there has to be a more representative, there has to be better representation in the IMF, and that's why, of course, the G20 has sprung into being. I think we're a long way from finding the best, the optimum international economic decision-making body. But I'd be interested to know what Sanjaya says from India's perspective.
Well, first of all, I agree with your replies to these earlier two questions. But you know, when it comes to China, you mentioned Article 4. I wonder what an IMF Article 4 report on the US economy would read like. It would be sensible. So, you know, in the last 3-4 years, many economies around the world have gone through a tough time. And the story has been that every one of them is trying to get back into shape through one means or another. I will not underestimate the capacity of China's economic and political leadership to address the challenges they face. I think we've lived through a decade of books that were titled "The Coming Crash of China," "The End of China," the bust. I don't believe all that stuff any longer. China is a growing proposition. It's there to stay. Its leadership has demonstrated the capacity to address the challenges they face. So I would imagine if they have a problem in the financial sector, they'll deal with it. They may not deal with it in an ideal kind of framework, but they'll deal with it as well as any other country today is dealing with problems in the banking system, in the financial system, in the budgetary system. I mean, which country in the world today has a well-managed budget or a well-managed banking system, right? So therefore, I would not worry too much about China's capacity to deal with its challenges. What I worry about is the internal division between what I call those in a hurry and those who are more mature. And the examples which are what are called in the media Chinese assertiveness with its neighbors, whether it with Japan or the Philippines or with India or somebody else, incidents that unnecessarily provoke the neighborhood. One doesn't know whether they're meant to provoke, whether the objective of these incidents is actually aimed at provoking or asserting, or it's an internal power struggle between the hawks and the doves, the hardliners, the PLA and the political leadership. One doesn't know. I mean, I'm not a China expert, but I know for a fact that we keep having these incidents. And I think that has an important role to play in shaping international perceptions about Chinese soft power or transparency. All the political battles in Western democracies, or rather in democracies around the world, they're all out there in the open. I mean, you pick up FT, you read every day what's happening in different political parties in India, right? All the dirty laundry is out there in the open. That's one of the weaknesses, but certainly a major strength of all open societies, that you know the downside risk much better. I think the problem with China is that one doesn't know the downside risk as well because of the lack of transparency.
Are there any more questions beyond Antonio? Very well, I think that's the last one.
Well,
Wait for Mike.
Mr. Chairman is here at the Institute. I just wanted to bring the BRICS framework into the discussion, especially regarding the talk about the China's currency rising. The mechanisms being discussed to trade and exchange credit between BRICS countries in local currencies, the viability of that in your views, and what threat it poses to the US, having in mind that despite their economic slowdown, these countries are still the five as most significant emerging economies.
I personally attach zero significance to the proposed BRICS bank. I just think it's irrelevant. If it does get off the ground, then it will just be another small regional financing institution. But I can't imagine, well, instead of saying what I can't imagine, can we imagine that China would be willing to, and this comes back to to Chris's question about how the Chinese want to spend their growing wealth. Why would the Chinese be willing to bail out India or Brazil or South Africa to the tune of tens of billions of dollars without any strings attached? And would South Africa or India or Brazil accept those strings? I can't imagine that. It might be a useful mechanism for a symbol of political cooperation, but as a practical financing or credit delivery mechanism, I think it's irrelevant.
Well, I actually agree with that. I mean, we had a discussion here in Arundel House of BRICS. Some of you there. I don't think this is. I mean, I would rule out at some point a revival of the BRICS project. but as of now, I don't think it's got off the ground. And I think its overall impact globally is going to be quite huge.
Thank you. I'll bring the meeting to a close then. ISS members should already have their copy of the book. Anyone who doesn't have it, it's at a reduced price of just £8 downstairs today. Only leaves for me to thank Sanjaya and particularly Alan for coming today, and thank you for joining us.